As we discussed on June 7th, Tom, private equity firm Vector Capital has successfully completed its acquisition of Riverbed Technology, a provider of secure networking and performance products for the enterprise. With the completion of this transaction, Dave Donatelli, a former EVP from the Cloud Business Group at Oracle, and somebody you may be familiar with, has assumed the role of CEO, while John Taylor, previously the CFO at MarkLogic, is returning to set Riverbed on a new course. This acquisition marks a new chapter for Riverbed, which has acquired a number of other products and technologies in its quest to become a one-stop shop for enterprise application acceleration. What's your take?
So I think it's interesting. First of all, for everybody out there, you have to remember there's two phases to an acquisition. There's when it gets announced, when everybody talks about it, and then there's when it actually closes, which is usually months later. And this happened to close in Q3. That's just the way that this stuff works. Secondly, new CEO time. So that means that Vector Capital obviously has different ideas in mind for the company than the previous CEO, which is fine. Dave Donatelli is a pretty good guy. I mean, he's held EVP positions just about everywhere. So he knows what he's doing. I think, though, that this is kind of an inflection point for Riverbed, because we've talked to them many times at Tech Field Day, and they've always kind of talked about a lot of their hardware platforms. I mean, if you think all the way back to some of their very first presentations, what do we hear about? We hear about their Steelhead devices that are on site. We hear about the fact that they're doing WAN acceleration. Honestly, their first biggest problem was they missed the boat on SD-WAN. They could have been the king of SD-WAN overnight with one simple decision, turning on that functionality on all their Steelhead devices, but they didn't. And so they were constantly playing catch up. And then they kind of pivoted into visibility and analytics as a secondary product line, which showed a lot of promise. The last time they presented at Field Day, a lot of people were very excited about that. They saw this as a capability that Riverbed could expand on. The problem, of course, is that when you're owned by a venture capital firm, which they were owned by Thoma Bravo and the Ontario Teachers Credit Union investing arm, which I didn't know was even a thing. You eventually have a runway that you're going to run out of because you have to service your debt. Like, this isn't a startup where you're going to burn through your cash. You literally owe these people money on a regular basis plus interest. And that's ultimately what sinks so many companies today. I mean, that's the reason why Toys R Us went out of business. They just couldn't service their debt. And so I hope that what's going to end up happening is that Riverbed is going to focus on the things that they need to focus on, and that they're going to be successful in selling them once they kind of get out from underneath this Chapter 11 stuff, which it looks like they're going to. What I don't hope is that it's going to mean that Riverbed's going to be chopped up and sold off into parts, which we have seen before, because that's a quick way to earn cash and pay down some debt and basically make the investors happy, so that when they get back to something that looks reasonable, they either spin it out on its own or sell it off to another company kind of quietly behind the scenes. Because that's the other thing too. Once you've been taken private in these kinds of deals, you are no longer required to report any of this stuff to the SEC until the sales are made and finalized. So a lot of times these companies can change hands very rapidly without anybody on the backside knowing anything about it. So good luck to Dave Donatelli and the rest of the Riverbed crew. Hope to hear great things from you in the future, and maybe we can get you back to a field day so you can talk to us about some of the cool stuff that you're working on. All right, Stephen, we had one story we wanted to take a little bit of a closer look at this week, and it turns out that it has everything to do with everyone's favorite open source operating system. The Linux community is abuzz with controversy once again because IBM Red Hat has put the source code for Red Hat Enterprise Linux behind a paywall, which we have previously talked about. Oracle has weighed in on this conversation this week. They have emphasized the commitment to Linux freedom, offering open access to binaries and source code for the Red Hat Enterprise Linux compatible distribution, Oracle Linux. On the other hand, SUSE Linux is taking a little bit more of an offensive move by forking Red Hat Enterprise Linux and investing millions in developing their own compatible distribution that's free from restrictions. The battle for supremacy is heating up. Each company is vying for dominance, championing their own respective vision of what openness and innovation should look like. Now, I want to take a quick minute here, Stephen, to kind of catch people up, because this is kind of interesting. the way that everything's falling out. So you may recall way back on June 28th, so like 2 weeks ago, what ended up happening is that Red Hat, which is now owned by IBM, restricted access for the source code for Red Hat Enterprise Linux, leaving CentOS Stream as the only available public repository of the code. That impacts a lot of decisions, or a lot of distributions like Alma Linux and Rocky Linux, because what they're effectively saying is, unless you play by our rules and sign up and agree to our terms, we're no longer going to give you access to the source code for you to build your distributions. Now, while this is all happening, the Linux community has completely freaked out about it, and they're very upset. And there's been a lot of pieces that have been written about this. And now we're starting to see the companies making the moves. And there's a lot of things that are going on here. But Stephen, you were one of the people who first reported on this story. I kind of wanted to get your take on, like, Oracle champion of freedom now.
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? I'm not a lawyer, and I'm not going to try to weigh in on the legality of what Red Hat has done, except to say that it's probably legal, considering that nobody has been sued out of business, and IBM has lawyers, and they probably checked on this stuff. My understanding is that essentially the open source license requires that anyone who gets binary access to software also has to have access to the source code. And that's pretty much what Red Hat's doing, if you kind of read between the lines. I don't think that they're doing it the way that people thought they would be doing it, but essentially Red Hat's the binary is only available to people who are subscribers or, basically have an account, and they're restricting the source code to those same people. So it seems like what they're doing is legal, but it certainly isn't in keeping with the expectations, let's say, of the open source community. A lot of people out there have long used Red Hat as their preferred Linux distribution. Even in the face of challengers, those of us who were more on the Debian side, a lot of us are using Ubuntu. There were certainly lots of SUSE believers out there as well. But over time, there's been some standardization in Linux, but still, the flavors are different enough that you're not going to want to use a different distribution entirely. Oracle was one of the companies that had a Red Hat like Linux that they offered as well. And so, given this situation, it's no surprise that Oracle was interested in emphasizing that their Oracle Linux, would remain, free as in speech, I guess, and that they would still support releasing open source and so on. They certainly are taking the opportunity to tweak their competitor, IBM/Red Hat, over this move. And they're encouraging people to switch to Oracle Linux. And, honestly, that probably leaves a lot of open source people with an upset stomach, but Oracle's been doing a pretty good job with MySQL, and Oracle Linux is pretty good. Unfortunately for Oracle, so is Ubuntu, so SUSE. So a lot of people have, not made that switch. But that being said, it is kind of funny to see Oracle poking them a little bit. But now we've got some news from SUSE, huh?
Yeah, SUSE has decided that they're going to work with Rocky Linux, and they're going to create their own fork of the distribution. And I got an email from the company that handles Rocky Linux, the owner, if you will. And they were basically saying that, we're committed to creating a bug for bug copy, for lack of a better term. And I thought that their way of doing it feels a little Rube Goldbergian, but it's still pretty ingenious. Like, what they're going to do is they're going to download container environments, and they're going to do paid for spot instances, and they're going to use those to extract the source code for Red Hat Enterprise Linux to use in updating their nightly builds and things like that. It is legal. It feels weird. Like, it's like saying, I'm going to go out and I'm going to buy a copy of this book so that I can read all the things in the book and then write a synopsis, even though the company says that I'm not allowed to do that. I mean, you kind of are, and Red Hat does not want to run afoul of the GPL. GPL says that if you offered this code for free, it has to be available for freely download. Now, Red Hat's saying it's still technically free. We can just register it. And I think it's kind of a weird dichotomy here. Because, Stephen, as you mentioned, there have been a lot of Linux distributions over the years, and they rise and fall in the community. And there's some of them are more geared toward commercial development and things like that. Some of them are a little bit more home based. I mean, I can remember when Fedora was the darling of everyone before it got bought by Red Hat and turned into a distribution channel. But I think that to me, the real weirdness here is that I can remember a time in the distant past when IBM was the champion of Linux. If you go all the way back to the SCO Linux dispute, where they got taken to court for a decade over all of this stuff, and how IBM was actively trying to defend the trademark and root out the whole Unix Linux split. And like, I remember, was it the Grok Law blog where waited with bated breath for the judge to release stuff, and now IBM is the bad guy. I mean, what happened? What happened is that eventually, when you take ownership of a product, you see that you have to institute controls on it. And I'm not defending IBM's decision. Lord knows we would get roasted if I did. I'm saying that I see where they're coming from as the steward of Red Hat Enterprise Linux, because this is not the first time that Red Hat has tried to do this. If you think back a couple of years with the CentOS thing, they really are trying to put some guardrails in place. The problem is that most people who work with open source, at least not the true champions, look at it as free as in freedom, free as in, whatever, liberty, not free as in beer. Everybody wants it to be free as in beer. I just want to go out, I want to download the stuff and run it on a PC at my house and not have to pay for it. And Red Hat is saying, well, you can do that, but we don't have a business if nobody pays for it. So I hope that this project doesn't end up creating these weird dividing lines in the community, because we have seen those before. And if you remember, SUSE was owned by Novell at one point. Novell had designs on making their own Linux, and that really never came to fruition. So are we just going to basically end up being kind of like Red Hat versus the world, or something else?
Yeah, I want to kind of take a big step back here too. I feel like I am a veteran of the distribution wars. I was one of the people who compiled that original Linux that was posted to Usenet way back when I was in an undergrad at WPI. I remember one of my roommates coming in and saying, hey, we should try to compile this new Minix style kernel and see what happens that this guy created. I was a veteran of a lot of the distributions, Yggdrasil, all these other Linux distributions that came over the years. Now it is sort of kind of coming down. And frankly, I think that the thing that's being forgotten here, whether things are legal, whether things are a good business decision, a lot of this doesn't matter as much in the cloud and the open source environment, when frankly, nobody's really paying for Linux distributions. Remember, the year of Linux desktops kind of came and went, didn't it? The truth is that it looks to me like a lot of stray dogs fighting over scraps here, because truly, who really cares about Linux distributions anymore? I know that people do, because frankly, as a user, as a developer, if you're in the DevOps space, you need to know what package manager you're running. Ubuntu with their snaps and apt and RPM and all these kind of things, that stuff matters. But honestly, we're in a Kubernetes and Helm chart world now. Do we really care what Linux operating system is being run under there? And are we really going to pay anything for it? In a lot of time, the answer is no. And I think that that's one reason, for example, that Ubuntu has gotten a lot of traction. I think it's another reason that, if you look under the hood of a lot of containers, there's a lot of people using Arch Linux and things like that. The reason is because they kind of don't care anymore. And frankly, that's my opinion on looking at this story from the outside. IBM's going to IBM. Red Hat, their business model, their name has become an adjective for the business model that they're in. You've got a Red Hat business model. That doesn't mean that they are Red Hat. It means that they're trying to give away the open source and then sell support and services around it. Red Hat's going to Red Hat. IBM's going to try to help Red Hat even better / worse, depending on your perspective. SUSE is going to SUSE. Canonical is going to Canonical. Everybody's going to do their thing to try to extract profit out of what is essentially, unfortunately to all of them, a commodity, which is the Linux operating system. And the Linux operating system is going to be increasingly commoditized by things like containerization and Ansible and Helm and to the point that, frankly, whatever. And to me, that's kind of how I'm looking at this story. I'm saying, is it good that SUSE is going to help Rocky Linux and invest all this money to have a hard fork that's going to be compatible with Red Hat so that you can continue to operate Red Hat with a free as in beer? Yeah, that's great. Thank you, SUSE. I'm really glad you're spending that money and investing that. Is it good that Oracle is reaffirming their commitment to open source? Yes. Is it good that there are other alternatives that don't involve this and aren't part of this battle? Yeah, because ultimately, I think that's where this all ends up.